Alright, this will help on some of the practice problems on 5.2, like number 17. Number 17, I think, actually is a little, sometimes I say one's easier than it looks. I think this one is actually harder than it looks. So we start with secant over cosecant plus cosecant over secant. The only reason it makes it a little more difficult is because it has those in it instead of sine and cosine. So the first thing I would do is change to sine and cosine. Well, we know secant is the reciprocal of cosine. So that top becomes 1 over cosine. Cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. So on the bottom we have the reciprocal of sine. Here, same thing on top, cosecant, that's the reciprocal of sine. And on the bottom secant, that's the reciprocal of cosine. So do that first. Now remember, with fractions like that, fractions within a fraction, we take the top, so 1 over cosine times the reciprocal of the bottom. And same thing here, the top times the reciprocal of the bottom. Well, that gives us sine x, oops, that's over 1, sorry. Sine x over cosine x plus cosine x over sine x. So it's a lot like what we started with, except for sine and cosine. Now if we want to add, we need a common denominator. Well, if we multiply our two denominators, we get cosine x sine x. Now this first fraction has a denominator of cosine x. We want it to have both of these, so we need to multiply it top and bottom by sine x. On the top, that'll be sine squared x. This one already has a sine x for the denominator. We want it to be cosine x sine x, so we're going to multiply it top and bottom by cosine x. So we end up with sine squared x plus cosine squared x over a common denominator. Well, that on top, that's one of our identities. Sine squared plus cosine squared is 1. So we get this. You could leave that for an answer, that's fine. Or if you wanted to, you could say, well, 1 over cosine is secant. 1 over sine is cosecant. You could write it like that. So either one of these is a correct answer. Let's look at 25. So on 25, we have cosine squared theta times tangent squared theta plus 1 equals 1. Now this is a verify problem. So we're definitely going to work on the left side because it's the most complicated. Well, first, I see a tangent squared plus 1. Well, tangent squared plus 1 is secant squared. So in place of that, we could put secant squared. So now we have that. Well, those are related to one another. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine. So let's change that secant squared to 1 over cosine squared. Well, now that gives us cosine squared over cosine squared. Well, those are the same top and bottom, so that's 1, and we verified it. While we're there, let's take a look at 27. Because one of the things that seems to give us trouble is this whole common denominator thing. This is actually not a tricky common denominator one, but it still has it. So I have 1 over 1 minus sine theta plus 1 over 1 plus sine theta equals 2 secant squared. So you can see here on the left, we're adding two fractions. Since the right is just one thing together, we need to combine these two fractions. Well, to combine them, we need a common denominator. Since they're different, we're going to take and multiply them together. So 1 minus sine theta times 1 plus sine theta. Well, now this first fraction has a 1 minus sign, but it doesn't have a 1 plus sign. So we're going to multiply top and bottom of this first one times 1 plus sine theta. Well, 1 plus sine times 1 is just 1 plus sine. This second fraction has a 1 plus sign, but it doesn't have a 1 minus sign. So we're going to multiply it top and bottom by 1 minus sign. So that times 1 is just plus 1 minus sine theta over our common denominator. Now, on the top, we can combine like terms. 1 plus 1 is 2. Sine theta and a negative sine theta is 0. So that's all we have on top. On the bottom, let's FOIL that out. First times first, 1 times 1 is 1. The outside 2 would be sine theta. The inside 2 would be a negative sine theta, so they cancel. Then I have minus, now I have sine times sine is sine squared theta. So now it looks like that. Now if you look at that bottom 1 minus sine squared, if we take this identity right here, if I move the sine squared to the other side, I get 1 minus sine squared equals cosine squared. So here on the bottom we have a 1 minus sine squared. Let's make that a cosine squared. We could leave our answer like that. That's perfectly fine. Or this is like 2 times 1 over cosine squared. Well, that means the reciprocal of cosine squared, where the reciprocal of cosine squared is secant squared. So you could write it like that. That would be okay too. That's just a few problems off of 5.2 to help you along there.